When X-Men 97 was first announced, and as the first look was released, I wasn't personally too excited since X-Men the Animated Series, the show it's continuing, was before my time if I'm being honest, and I would have simply preferred a new animated series. The trailer definitely helped with the animation looking a lot cooler than it did in Marvel's other animated Disney Plus show. That being said, as I mentioned in my first X-Men 97 video, I was absolutely dug in by the end of episode 2 and absolutely blown away by the end of episode 5. In that first video, I basically did a mid-season review, reviewing and rating each individual episode as well as some generalities that are true for the entire show, before seeing what the average rating for the series is. In this video, I'll be completing that, doing the following 5 episodes before then doing a short full season review and seeing what the rating for this season is. Some of you might know that I also did do a video about episode 6 individually with the hope that it would lead to me doing an episode review for each individual episode, but after episode 6 I wasn't actually able to do that for every episode. So with that in mind, I won't be spending too much time on episode 6. If you want to see the full review, link will be in the cards and in the description. As of episode 5, the average of the season was an 8.4 out of 10, which I predicted would go up by the end of the season just by nature of there being a 3-part finale, and that would probably end up being amazing. Spoiler alert, it definitely did go up. Before we get to the individual episodes, let's discuss the generalities that are true for every episode, all of which is basically just an expansion of what I already said in the first video. The intro is still fantastic and unskippable. The music is incredible, the visuals are fantastic, and the fact that every episode changes, including in which characters appear and the people in the background turning into prime sentinels. Every episode was a treat to see what would be different. Not that I'd ever skip the intro, even if it never changed. Speaking of the visuals, I'm not kidding when I say that X-Men 97 is legitimately one of the best looking animated series of all time. The blending between 3D and 2D animation and the incorporation of the original show's art style is seamless. The animation itself is super fluid and so high quality. The action is exciting and the colors on display in every episode is always breathtaking. In certain aspects of both visuals and animation, X-Men 97 breaks new ground, and it leads to genuinely one of the best looking animated series of all time. As for the voice acting, I mentioned in the first video how there wasn't much voice acting that stood out to me outside of maybe Magneto and Storm, but I felt like that was more so because those characters were simply the best written. Not only did the next 5 episodes give us some new characters or some better moments for the old characters, but even in the first video, I don't think I gave enough credit to Rogue or Gambit's voice actors, and I didn't give them their fair due. In these next 5 episodes, the voice actors for Magneto, Storm, and Rogue were still definitely highlights, while both Cyclops and especially I think Bastion had their strong standout moments. Beyond that, the writing, whether that be the dialogue or storytelling, is superb, and the show's shock value is immense. It's crazy how often this show just blew me away and shocked me by what happened on screen. Okay, so let's begin with the individual episode reviews. Episode 6 is titled Lifedeath Part 2, and again, I won't be talking about this one for very long. Just to summarize the review, the Professor X side of the story did a good job at introducing and building up a bit of the cosmic side of the X-Men, accompanied by some really cool and unique looking visuals and some interesting characters. It all comes to a head in this fantastic moment when Xavier's attempted heroic speech was interrupted by him learning about Genosha and instantly switching priorities. This worked really well as kind of the connecting through line between the 2 stories of the episode, with the theme of the importance of what they're going through being undermined by the news of the Genosha tragedy. Storm's adventure was never quite as interesting. It did have a pretty creepy villain. Storm's flaws were explored a bit, which made her feel a bit more real. And what it all led to, Storm getting her powers back alongside a new, much better suit, was obviously really awesome, mostly because of the animation and music. I actually don't think that Storm getting her powers back was adequately built up to, though. It didn't feel like she had enough time to get over her issues. The episode ended with the reveal that Mr. Sinister was behind the Genosha attack, which at the time did feel like the season's villain reveal. Turns out it wasn't, but still a cool moment regardless. Episode 6 did technically bring down the average a bit by being an 8, but every following episode brings it up higher. Episode 7 is titled Bright Eyes, and as the episode right before the start of the 3-part finale, I expected it to be a bit of a calm before the storm, but that couldn't be further from the truth. This actually feels like a 4-part finale, with episode 6 being the calm before the storm and the bridge between episode 5 and everything else. The season just does not slow down at this point. This episode focuses a lot on the aftermath of the Genosha massacre, starting with Gambit's funeral, highlighted by Nightcrawler's speech, which, as the show is in general and him specifically, is just expertly written. From there, Rogue is given primary focus as she interacts with other sections of the Marvel Universe, which was really cool. Genosha was an event that felt like something that would warrant bringing in reactions from the rest of the Marvel Universe, especially a universe like this one, which was built up and established decades ago. Now, obviously, it was pretty awesome to see Captain America in this episode, but I will say that he is the source of maybe my only big complaint with this episode. His characterization of not being willing to act does feel like a non-X-Men character being written a bit out of character so that the X-Men would look better in an X-Men story. That being said, I kind of feel bad for Cap here. How is he gonna get that shield back? I mean, Rogue really put that in the middle of nowhere. From there, Rogue's story does a good job of showing the aftermath of Gambit's death, and does a good job at leading into her kind of switching sides in the next episode to join Magneto, even though there is a moment in this episode where she does feel like she's maybe starting to get over it as she has the X-Men around her. That does completely turn around in the end of this episode, which we'll get back to. On the other side of things, while Rogue is interacting with the rest of the Marvel Universe, the X-Men visit Genosha. The scenery was haunting and yet a bit inspiring, as many people are seen helping. Beast stands out here as he talks so differently to how he typically does, with far less cartooniness and camp, putting all that aside during these serious moments, giving his own opinion on things that aren't just the exact right thing to say. It was easily the most real Beast had ever felt in this series, and that includes the episodes that came after. During these moments in Genosha, there are some small character moments between like Jubilee and Sunspot, or Cyclops and Jean, with the haunting scenery and excellent writing, which made for some engaging character moments. Even a bit of emotion in regards to Madeline's death and how that impacts Scott. The reveal that the main villain is Mr. Sinister kind of went out the window immediately, as this episode reveals that it's someone else. X-Men fans would probably already know this and recognize the character as Bastion, but for somebody who doesn't know who Bastion is, I do think this episode, and the season in general, did a great job at introducing him and building him up. Also revealing that Magneto was alive and in his captivity right at the end. For the first 20 or so minutes of this episode, it definitely felt like the aftermath to the Genosha massacre and a bit of a break, and like I said, I expected it to be the calm before the storm, but that break did not last the entire episode, so this episode ended up being very similarly structured to episode 5, with the first 20 or so minutes being a bit slower and character focused, with the last 10 minutes, or whatever the percentage of that would be in episode 5, going so hard. The setting of the big city in the night and in the rain made for a visually spectacular few scenes, which includes the shocking moment of Rogue just no longer caring and letting Trask fall to his death. And this was very shocking, because like I said, Rogue's storyline up until this point, and especially that final moment between her and Nightcrawler and the rest of the X-Men, did make it feel like she's going towards a more generic character arc of getting over her grief. Not only was this a shocking moment in isolation, but from there, the episode just doesn't slow down for a second. The X-Men's reaction and Rogue's angry and crying monologue made for such an intense and dark moment, but that didn't even manage to end, as she's cut off by being attacked by somebody saying, "Exterminate mutants." And then you have the reveal that Trask is alive and he's a Prime Sentinel, or what we would later learn to be a Prime Sentinel. He's a human Sentinel, that's all we knew at this point. And then the ensuing action scene is beautifully animated in the aforementioned incredible scenery. It's intense, it's exciting, Morph turning into Quicksilver as a cameo is awesome, and the stakes feel really high, especially since in episode 5 they just killed off one of the X-Men. There's really nothing stopping them from doing that again. But then Cable shows up and saves the day, but even then it doesn't slow down, because the X-Men learn about Bastion and they learn that Cable is Nathan Summers, which ended up kind of being the beating heart of the 3-part finale, so this episode did a really good job at setting that up. In general, this was a fantastic episode. The first 20 or so minutes was very character focused and did a really good job of building into the last 10 minutes, which were absolutely incredible. It's like a lighter version of episode 5, so not a 10 out of 10, but a surprisingly great episode. Episode 8 is titled Tolerance is Extinction Part 1, and is the beginning to the nearly perfect 3-part finale. Off the back of Bright Eyes, this episode wastes no time getting right into the thick of things, as the revelation to Cyclops that Cable is their son is explored and is continually explored throughout the episode, as the Summers family kind of find themselves teaming up with each other, leading to some really awesome, really fun, and some sentimental moments. So like I said earlier in the video, these last 4 episodes go crazy on the Marvel references and cameos. It starts with a reference to Kamar-Taj as they're talking about absolute points, and then we see a lot of other characters, including Dr. Doom and Zemo. Dr. Doom specifically to see was absolutely awesome, but obviously the highlight cameo here is Spider-Man. I mean, it's just so cool, and I do think it contributes a bit more than just fan service, which I talk about later on in the review, specifically in the review for episode 10, the finale. This episode has a bit more of the Sunspot side story, which continues to be maybe the least interesting part of the show, although the way it ended in this episode with his mom telling him to go with the Sentinels was a bit more interesting and led to Sunspot's turn in the next episode being more believable. Along the way, until about 18 minutes into the episode, this episode does a lot of explaining of both the Prime Sentinels and Bastion's backstory, which worked to build up what was then established as the primary conflict of the episode, and it helps that Bastion's voice is so effectively sinister. As somebody who knew nothing about the Prime Sentinels or Bastion, I think this episode and the series in general did a good job of explaining who the character is. And yet again, for like the 4th time this season, the last 10 or so minutes are absolutely insane, as dozens of people turn into Prime Sentinels and attack mutants. What came out of this was some insane action and badass character moments, with some highlights like the aforementioned Summers family team up, but even more so, it's Nightcrawler and Wolverine who get their time to shine. With Wolverine looking absolutely badass in certain shots, his scene of falling from the sky, slicing up some Sentinels, it's one of the coolest action scenes in this show, and so creative, the type of thing that you can only really do in animation. Nightcrawler's fight scene with his 3 swords is so well animated and so fluid, with the same going for his team up with Logan. But possibly my single favorite moment of the entire episode is the POV Nightcrawler teleportation scene, even more so than Wolverine's falling scene. It's such a fantastic display of the advantages of animation and so well done. When that was happening, I was shocked. Like, they kind of just blew my mind in that moment. It's so cool. And of course, the ending of the episode is insane as well, with Valerie Cooper's monologue and especially the line "Magneto was right" being incredible, leading to Magneto causing a worldwide blackout. Obviously the cameos are all awesome, but even without that, the moment is another one of those shocking and unexpected moments, something the show has no shortage of. And then Professor X returns, leading into the next episode, which was the actual ending to the episode, and a pretty great one. This episode is yet another fantastic episode and a great first part to the 3-part finale. Episode 9 is titled Tolerance is Extinction Part 2, and is practically a non-stop barrage of insane moments. In this episode, Bastion actually takes a back seat as main villain and acts more like a secondary main villain, or at least splits his time as main villain with Magneto. On one hand, that does fall into the trope of Magneto being the villain of like every X-Men project. On the other hand, that trope exists because Magneto is genuinely one of the most effective villains in media history, especially when handled well, and this show I'd say handled him wonderfully, with his turn to a more heroic persona being completely undermined by the Genosha Massacre, which radicalized him right back to being maybe even more so against humans than ever. And not only does that make Magneto's role in this episode as effective as it is, but it also makes the Magneto versus Professor X debate much less clear-cut, much less hero versus villain, which comes to a head relatively early into this episode, with Magneto approaching the X-Men out of nowhere to offer some of them to join him, and a few of them actually do so. This is similar to the moment in X-Men First Class, but while I love that movie, I never truly believed it when Mystique abandoned Xavier. Here, after the events of episode 5 and 8, I don't doubt that Rogue and Sunspot would be radicalized to join Magneto. Speaking of Rogue and Magneto, they both changed their outfits back to older suits, just like Storm did, and later on, almost everyone else changes their looks as well. For Magneto, this is symbolic of him returning to his villainous role, and it's entirely welcome. It is a much more iconic look. And the same goes for Rogue. I do like this look. Forge and Cable get X-Men suits, officially joining them to the team, which is pretty cool. I don't have much of an opinion on Morph or Jubilee's suits. They're both pretty good, but so were the old ones. Wolverine's blue and yellow suit being destroyed, leading to him getting the brown suit, is pretty cool, although spoiler alert, it was instantly destroyed. If I have anything to say about this episode that maybe is a negative, it's Jean and Scott's suits, which are simply a huge downgrade for both of them. Cyclops looks way less cool without the open hair and chest strap, and Jean somehow manages to look silly even in animation. I won't hold that too much against the episode, and the X-Men suiting up scene was still pretty cool. This episode had a lot of small character moments in the beginning leading up to Magneto's recruiting and a bit after as as well. I'm not going to point all of them out, but in general these scenes are really well written and really great, with one standout being Jean saying to Storm, make them mind your weather, and Storm replying, and you make them weather your mind, because holy shit, that goes so hard. It doesn't even need to be mentioned, but the ensuing fights are fantastically animated, and they come up with some incredible moments and aspects to it, like Morph turning to the Hulk and the animation surrounding him going so hard that I now want a Hulk show in this style. I want a show for every character, a Spider-Man show, a Daredevil show, an Avengers show, all set in this universe. It would just be so cool. Beast coming in with the one-liners, Jean and Sinister's entire showdown, the short argument between Charles and Magneto, the visuals of Bastion's room, the incredible animation of Storm's powers and the scenery of the sky in that sequence, and Cable's anime moment and the use of his powers. I mean, at this point, I'm just listing off everything that happens, because yeah, everything that happens is so cool and so well done in every conceivable regard. But obviously the highlight of this episode is the ending, which just shocks you to your core. Wolverine just straight up stabs Magneto, drawing blood for what is apparently the first time in this universe. And then of course, the Fatal Attractions moment ripped straight from the comics, a comic moment that I was definitely familiar with, something they never could have done in the original show, and something they never even had the balls to do in the movies. Magneto rips the adamantium out of Wolverine's body, and then the episode just ends with no warning on a shot ripped straight from the comics. How the hell does this show just keep on getting better and better, and how does it keep on shocking me so much? This is insane, truly top tier, week to week, cliffhanger waiting spectacle TV. Episode 5 is still the best episode, and I say that even as the season finale has released, but the fact that this show keeps on blowing me away and shocking me just episode to episode, it's staggering and not something I've experienced with the show in a long time. Speaking of, that brings us to the finale. The season finale of X-Men 97 is episode 10, entitled Tolerance is Extinction Part 3, and absolutely does not disappoint. From the get-go, the first thing I noticed was the runtime of 42 minutes, the longest episode of the season by a relatively large margin. This is something that I've always felt with the Marvel Disney Plus shows. Basically, every time you get to the finale, it feels like there's so much left to do and so much left to tell. It feels like they're teeing up a much longer finale episode, and yet the finale always ends up being the same length as every other episode and ends up being rushed. This 42-minute runtime was a very good sign for this finale, the fact that it's the longest episode of the season, as I think the finale typically should be. Also in the beginning, the intro features a new scene of Xavier and Eric from their shared backstory, which leads right into the beginning of the episode, and a lot of the episode in general, the moments inside Charles and Magneto's minds, which acted as a sort of a B story or a B plot that connected to the main story right at the end. I loved getting to see the first meeting between Charles and Eric, and I love the exploration of Magneto's character and backstory, the focus on his childhood growing up as a Jew during the Holocaust, because like it did when he said never again in episode 2, or the focus on his tattoos in episode 8, this backstory and his relatively understandable radicalization as a result of it makes for such powerful moments and such impactful lines. Helped by Magneto's great voice acting, this episode had so many moments between Xavier and Magneto that remind us to how Magneto is one of the most interesting characters in fictional history, as if the last episode didn't already do that, and there are moments that even evoke a strong level of emotion. It all leads up to Magneto's triumphant return and stopping the asteroid, which was pretty awesome, but it's a moment I'll have to get back to later. Before that, right after the opening Magneto and Professor X focus scenes, the episode goes insane on the cameos, and continues to do that throughout, with some standouts like Captain America, who even has a bit of a role in this episode, Iron Man in a very old-fashioned looking suit that fits right into this universe, Daredevil looking so goddamn cool, Doctor Strange, Black Panther, Cloak and Dagger, Morph as Mr. Fantastic, Peter Parker and MJ, which is important since Spider-Man the Animated Series ended with MJ going missing. Then there's also a few mutants who show up on images, including one character who was purposefully missing from X-Men the Animated Series, and very noticeably so, Kitty Pryde, and so many others. Now yes, cameos are definitely a very easy way to get people excited, but for this season specifically, the cameos were used in such a way that it isn't just for the sake of fan service or a cheap, cool moment. They're used to show off the full Marvel animated universe on display, and are used to successfully make the story feel like a universe-wide event that focuses on the X-Men. X-Men, and not just an X-Men solo title story. Seeing characters like Daredevil fighting on the street or Captain America trying to give the X-Men support from within the White House, it does make the stakes feel higher, the universe more coherent, and the story more all-encompassing, while definitely setting the X-Men as the primary and most important superhero team in this universe. That being said, yeah, I'd be lying if I said the fan service wasn't working on me because it's so cool. I mean, Daredevil showing up in this episode was such a highlight. Now, getting back to the actual story, after the split focus between Magneto and Bastion as the villains of episode 9, this episode, the finale, fittingly gives Bastion his main villain focus, and while Bastion is no Magneto, he is certainly more of a departure from most X-Men stories, and I'd say a welcome one at that. His dialogue was great, and I love his voice acting, even if he now does talk a bit more like he comes from this universe, and doesn't stand out as much because of it. Still though, I think he really works well as a foil to the X-Men's main message of embracing the future, and how he is now the future incarnate, which does come to a head in a moment later on. A large focus of that, and the episode in general, is actually on Cable, through whom we get a lot of great Summers family moments that I'll get back to later on as well. I will say that Phoenix showing up just for like a minute did feel a bit out of nowhere, and maybe that's just me not being as well versed in X-Men lore as I need to be to understand it, but beyond that, I would say that I loved how Mr. Sinister was defeated. His begging for mercy before being teased and punched by Morph was definitely really satisfying for a character that is so cartoonishly evil as a character named Mr. Sinister. From there, the A-plot of this episode is basically just a lot of fighting between the X-Men and Bastion, and I do not mean that as a negative. As a season finale, it would be disappointing if there wasn't a large amount of screen time dedicated to heroes fighting the villain, especially in a show that is as well animated and as good looking as this one, and in a show that has clearly not had problems with killing off its characters, and so the stakes feel real. The Bastion versus Rogue fight was incredibly well animated. It starts with Rogue saying his name was Gambit, remember it, which hits so hard, and when the pendulum turns in Bastion's favor, I definitely felt a bit nervous for Rogue. Roberto finally calling himself Sunspot was a cool moment, especially because of how cool his powers look. And then comes the fight between Bastion, Nightcrawler, Cyclops, and Jubilee. Again, all so well animated and so nerve-wracking, especially in the Nightcrawler part. Cyclops really shines here, having some really badass moments like a ricochet eye blast, and a straight up anime moment of screaming "You'll never hurt my family again," and then just straight up overpowering the villain's beam with his own beam by screaming louder, and it all happens so fast. Cyclops really comes off as an absolute badass in this season. Jubilee also has her own badass moment with just insane animation. I just seriously cannot get enough of how good this show looks and how great the animation is. Like, it just came out after Invincible Season 2, and it makes Invincible Season 2 look way worse by comparison, and I don't want to dislike that show, but it's crazy how fantastic the animation of X-Men 97 is, in comparison and just in a vacuum. At this point, I was too engrossed in the action and the fight scenes that I completely forgot that America straight up nuked Asteroid M, which came at a pivotal moment where it felt like the X-Men were going to break through to Bastion, and yet again, X-Men 97 is just completely blindsiding me with the directions it goes in. Bastion's death isn't epic or emotional, it kind of just happens, and I feel like that is a bit fitting. What is emotional is the Summers family scene that comes right after, with Cyclops and Jean saying goodbye to Cable as they believe they are going to die, and this might just be my favorite moment of the episode. The dialogue and line delivery here is incredible. Seeing Cyclops' eyes feels so incredibly impactful and adds so much weight to the scene. It's crazy how much emotion this show gets out of this insane and messed up clone time travel family where the father and mother are a lot younger than the son and one of them isn't even their parent. It all comes down to parents and their son mourning the lack of each other's presence in their lives, and it genuinely got a little bit of a tear out of me. It's the most emotional moment in the season in my opinion. And of course, the ensuing attempted heroic sacrifice of all the X-Men is incredible and so climactic. Of course, it became pretty clear at this point that Magneto was going to save them, and of course that was an awesome moment as well. What wasn't as clear was where it was going to go from there. The day looks like it was about to be saved, and then everyone is just randomly teleported away, and now nobody knows what happens, and then we just jump to 6 months later. This show just never lets up. I mean, goddamn, never a second of rest. At this point, I had no idea what was happening, and I'm sure that was by design. And then Bishop shows up and says the X-Men have been yanked out of time and we're teased season 2, which just seems like we'll have a lot more time travel, a lot more apocalypse, and a bit of Horseman of Death Gambit. Now, yeah, a cliffhanger where it's a season and now we're gonna have to wait like a year to find out what's happening is so frustrating. It's a very effective one because, man, am I looking forward to X-Men 98 or X-Men 97 season 2. Episode 5 is still definitely better than this finale, but this finale I'd say deserves a 10 out of 10, as do multiple episodes in this season. The average rating of the season is an 8.8, which is already a fantastic average. But I'd actually round that up not to a 9, but rather a 10, because if I'm going to give any season of television a 10 out of 10, it would be this one. X-Men 97 Season 1 is a fantastically produced, expertly written, incredibly animated, gorgeous, emotional, exciting, and shocking season of TV that absolutely blew my expectations away to become what I think is the single best X-Men related piece of media ever made, which is saying a lot given how good these are, the best Marvel animated TV show ever made, which is also saying a lot given how good these are, the best Disney Plus show ever made, which is also saying a lot given how good these are, and just generally an extraordinary piece of media that makes me appreciate the X-Men more than ever. This season was incredible. I could not see how good this was coming. Thanks for watching this video, and let me know your thoughts in the comments down below.